Okay, so welcome to everybody to this book presentation of the volume by Cecilia Bassen and Tobias Ogerland, Jesus, the Apocalyptic Prophet. This is an event organized by the Enoch Seminar, one of the many live online events organized by the Enoch Seminar during this past year and a half. We will continue, however, to be online for the years to come. We are very, very pleased to have with us the two authors of the volume, very important volume on the historical Jesus. And we are also very pleased to have some distinguished panelists, Amy Jill Levine and James Crossley, who will help us in a conversation about this volume. About the format of this event, we will start with a very brief 10-minute presentation by the authors that will remind us of the many features of the most important features of the volume. It will be followed by three responses by Amy Jean Levine, James Crossley, and myself, and we will offer a response to the work of this volume. Then we will leave the opportunity to our authors, Cecilia and Tobias, to respond, to say a first brief response to the questions that will be raised by the respondents. And then we will open the floor to the discussion among all people that are attending this webinar session. During the entire period of this presentation, you are welcome to use the chat to express the comments or questions at any time during the entire period of our session. And after the presentations by the respondents and the authors, you may join the conversation. And you have the feature raise hand at the bottom of your screen if you want to be introduced in the room, and we welcome everybody to join us. Okay, so thank you very much to everybody for joining this program, to the respondents, the authors, the many participants that are attending these sessions live on webinar or on Facebook, or those who will listen to this recorded session later on Facebook or on the page of the Enoch Seminar. So Cecilia and Tobias, first of all, thank you for joining us, for being with us today. And I want immediately to give you the opportunity to introduce briefly your work.
Well, thank you, Gabriella. First, I would like to thank Gabriella and Joshua for organizing this event. We really appreciate the opportunity to discuss our book with our esteemed colleagues. And I'd like to thank AJ, James, and Gabriella for taking the time to read our book carefully and write responses. We really appreciate that. So big thanks. So I would like to share the screen just to show the table of contents, to introduce the book. So here we go. So as you see, we have a brief introduction where we explain what kind of text the Gospels are and how we work as historians. And we also explain to the readers how to use this book. So we give them we explain that there is a glossary of names and terms at the end, so they know that right from the beginning. and that there is an index and a list of chronology and so on. And we explain from the outset what kind of approach we take. We say that it's a fundamental principle in historical research into Jesus is that we must approach the Gospels from a critical perspective, just as we approach other ancient literature. So we say that, try to explain that from the beginning, so to speak. And then for the first 2 chapters, we give an introduction to Judaism at the time of Jesus, and talk about how life might have been in Galilee during this period, at the late Second Temple period and under Roman occupation. And then we move to chapter 3, the Jesus of the Gospels and the Jesus of history, where we talk about the Gospels as historical sources and how we as historians are using them to try to get behind the text. So what kind of historical research are we doing and how do we do it? And then chapter 4, we introduce John the Baptist, and we claim, like most scholars, that he was Jesus' mentor. And for the next few chapters, 5, the prophet leader, 6, the kingdom, 7, in conflict with Satan, we outline Jesus' main message and mission. So we're building a portrait or reconstruction of him as an apocalyptic prophet who was proclaiming the imminent coming of the kingdom. And then chapter 8, Jesus and the laws, we go into his view on the Torah, and we present him as a law observant man who then was engaged in debates. So there are conflict stories that we explain what they are about, and that they are inner Jewish debates, of course, about how to live according to the Torah. Chapter 9, the Anointed One, we go into Jesus' self-perception. And we argue that it must have been a process of some kind. And the final week in chapter 10, we go into some detail into the events that led up to his arrest and execution, and we compare the 4 Gospels very carefully on these different accounts. And then at the end, chapter 11, I think this is a different ending than most of these books on the historical Jesus, that we continue past his death. And in chapter 11, from a Jewish group to a multi-ethnic movement in the Roman Empire, we try to explain how it happened that a thoroughly Jewish movement eventually turned into something different. The process when the Gentiles were coming in, and how the whole movement turned less and less Jewish, so to speak. So this is the outlined in broad strokes what we're doing. And Tobias going to say a few words about how we see the book in the context of other historical Jesus books.
Yes, and first of all, I would like to say, just like Cecilia did, thank you to the organizers and to the distinguished panelists on this event, and for all participants who are joining us. When you see this outline of our book, you may ask yourself, is there really a need for yet another book on the historical Jesus? What can such a book offer, and to whom? One of our reasons for writing this book, Jesus the Apocalyptic Prophet, is that we realized that many of all those excellent books already present on Jesus are actually beginning to grow a little old. So when teaching courses on the historical Jesus, we have been using such fine works as E.P. Sanders's The Historical Figure of Jesus, Paula Fredrikson's Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. But those books were published over 20 or even over 25 years ago. And the 1990s and the first decade of the current millennium saw the publication of a virtual flood of Jesus books. John P. Meyer, John Dominic Crossan, Ben Witherington, Gerd Tyson, and Annette Mertz, James Dunn, Dale Allison, and many others had their sometimes massive volumes printed, read, and discussed. But since the early 2010s, comprehensive books on Jesus seem to have been coming out less frequently. And so we felt the need for a book that is up to date, accessible, in the sense that it can be used even by undergraduate students, and still with a distinct profile drawn from the author's own research. So this is what we have tried to accomplish by writing this book together, and it remains, of course, to be seen to what extent the reviewers think that we have succeeded. So what aspects of this 2021 book stand out as different from a book published in, say, 1994, the year of publication for Sanders's Historical Figure of Jesus? I think there are at least 3 points at which one can detect clear changes in the scholarly and educational landscape, and they relate to audience, ancient context, and theoretical and methodological framework. So to begin with the audience, students beginning to learn about historical Jesus research used to come from a theological background. Sanders, for example, in his book, spent quite some time and space on explaining the differences between a theological and a historical view of Jesus and the Gospels. And happily, we still have lots of theology students doing biblical studies and historical Jesus studies. We have tried not to neglect some of their concerns in our book. But we can no longer assume that background for the students. Many of them need to be introduced to basic matters about, for example, the contents of the Gospels, at the same time as they are being introduced to historical critical analysis of the material. And this is something that we have tried to stay conscious of throughout the writing of this book. And secondly, ancient context. Ancient Judaism has rightly been established as the self-evident context for the historical Jesus. But our knowledge of ancient Judaism has increased tremendously over the past 25 to 30 years, not least through the full publication and subsequent analysis of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we have been able to situate Jesus within a reconstruction of ancient Judaism that builds not only on Josephus, the so-called pseudepigrapha, traditions from rabbinic literature, but also on the scrolls. And as you may know, one of us is an accomplished Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, and that really helped in writing this book, I can promise. And thirdly, theoretical and methodological framework. There is now a very lively discussion about which theories of history underlie or should underlie Jesus research. And as many of you know, the whole enterprise of sifting the gospel material with the help of so-called authenticity criteria, and then to build up the historical Jesus from these so-called authentic pieces, has been cast into doubt, especially by scholars who suggest that Jesus research needs to be informed by social memory theory. And we have done our best to consider this discussion. We thought it's wise not so much to highlight the definitions and uses of specific criteria as to employ the sound historical critical principles that these criteria have been meant to encapsulate. And the result, the overall result of our reconstruction is essentially in harmony with, for example, that of Dale Allison, who wrote his 2010 book, Constructing Jesus from an Explicit Memory Theoretical Perspective. So much for an introduction, I think. And I think we are most eager to hear what the reviewers have to say now.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And now we have our first presentation. I mean, we want to keep it quite informal. just in order to foster a conversation. We have a lot of distinguished guests also in attendance. But first of all, we would like to hear from Amy G. Levine from Vanderbilt, Professor of New Testament from Vanderbilt University. Thank you for being with us, AJ.
Thank you. And what a pleasure it is to be with you all. I'm trusting you can hear me okay. Fabulous. Well, cheers to Cecilia and Tobias for writing a helpful volume that represents indeed the best of both current scholarship and rhetorical clarity. And congratulations are also due to Kian J. Power for a splendid translation. There's much here to be celebrated, in particular the appeals to Qumran material. So here I echo Tobias's initial comment, the Isaiah Targum, and to the Psalms of Solomon. And here the authors draw from their earlier scholarship. The careful work on purity is simply quotidian. The recognition of, among other things, Jesus' ethnocentrism or particularity as opposed to some sort of universal mission, his intensification of halakhic practice, the idea that, quote, the Messiah had to die was not an easy sell. I think that was well put. The logic of the Johannine dating for the Passion, and a recognition that the Gospels do have anti-Jewish polemics. Now, book reviews can take the form of judgments that stifle rather than promote conversation. They can be arch, they can be nasty, and I find that generally unpleasant. As a genre, book reviews tend to focus on the critique, an approach that often serves to display the reviewer's own particular academic prowess, and then you learn more about the reviewer than you do about the book. So a conversation as we are having, and what a brilliant idea, Gabriella, offers at least two needed benefits. First, it allows for communication rather than contention, because I prefer that scholarship be mutually supportive rather than agonistic. And second, it helps correct for the inevitable slippage between what the authors intended to say and what the reviewer gleaned. So in these brief comments, I'll highlight the parts of the volume that I both appreciated, indeed I appreciated it all, but also find myself with questions concerning method and evidence and some matters of clarification. So 4 general concerns, and the first on the doing of history. The authors begin by defining how they understand part of the historical enterprise, and Tobias has already introduced this. They state, we will not assume the existence of angels, demons, spirits, gods, or any other supernatural beings. They take healing narratives and exorcisms as related to conversion disorders, which they describe as conditions that seemingly have a physical cause, but may in reality be the result of intense psychological or social stress. They see Jesus as curing people in terms of removing the subjective experience of illness and also the social consequences that would accompany such symptomology. I find this approach appropriate, although it is receiving some pushback from certain scholars, especially those located outside or sympathetic to those located outside North Atlantic cultures, for whom this non-supernatural view denies the cultural truths of others, seeks to replace faith with secularism and trust in the professionalization of medicine, and otherwise marginalizes a lot of people in the classrooms in the pew. Such pushback would be compatible, I think, for example, with the recent posting in the journal Political Theology that argues, quote, the synoptic problem is a retrojection of whiteness into biblical texts, given its concern for property ownership and copyright. Well, all authors have agendas, and our authors even talk about the agenda of the author of the 4th gospel. So I was curious as to how Cecilia and Tobias would respond to the charge that they are promoting Western hegemonic values, or more delicately, how does their own social location influence the approach that they take and the conclusions that they draw? Second, on gospel content. The authors find Jesus, quote, offering a critique of social injustice and a hopeful message of aid for the poor and outcast. In supporting their claim, they cite Luke 6:21, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. And rhetorically, this sounds good. In fact, it sounds like most sermons heard in liberal churches in the United States, where the homilist is expected to use terms such as poor, outcast, marginal, and disenfranchised, along with seeing Jesus as doing something radical. Less clear in the sermons and in the volume is just who these outcast or even poor are and whether Jesus got much of a response from them. For example, our authors tell us that the peasants and fishermen who belonged to Jesus' circle did not regard themselves as poor as they could support themselves. So first, I'm wondering, who are the peasants in the inner circle? And second, who are the poor? Are they beggars who in fact have a socially sanctioned job? Are they the disabled? And if so, how? Given that the majority of the disabled individuals in the Gospels seem to be supported by familial or friendship groups. And next, what exactly is Jesus' good news other than the world is about to end? So our authors tell us that Jesus, quote, protested against certain social norms through his words and actions, criticizing the prevailing system and demanding change, as did Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and Mohandas Mahatma Gandhi did. Well, I'm not sure that Buddha and Gandhi are the right models, though I find the idea intriguing, especially if the overall conceit is that Jesus is an apocalyptic prophet, because I don't think either the Buddha or Gandhi were. Apocalyptic prophets may well have strong ethical values, but ultimately they are less social critics than they are proclaimers of a divine cleaning up. When I think of John the Baptizer or Paul or the writers of various texts we've come to call apocalypses, or later apocalyptic prophets like Shabtai Zvi or Jacob Frank or David Koresh or Jim Jones or William Miller, the focus is less on social justice and more on the end of society as we know it. And finally, how is Jesus' approach of voluntary poverty good news to the poor who don't have a choice in the matter? Adding 1 more or 12 more people to the list of poor just means fewer available resources for the poor and probably more resources for those who are not poor. Number 3, on Jesus' behavior vis-a-vis women and matters of sexuality. The authors note that Jesus and his followers are suspected of wanton living. I should note, by the way, that when I was a child, in the old conservative prayer book for Judaism for Yom Kippur, one of the sins that the congregation confesses is forgive us for our wanton acts. And I didn't know what a wanton act was, but I knew what wontons were. And I thought it had something to do with going to Chinese restaurants that weren't kosher. Side note. Jesus and his followers are suspected of wanton living, which our authors define in terms of eating and drinking, as well as associating with tax collectors and prostitutes, because both categories were represented in the Jesus movement. And the authors cite to support this claim, Matthew 21:31, actually the second part of the verse, truly, amen, I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. But that verse need not indicate that prostitutes were within his group or even within his dining companions. It's a single reference. Matthew immediately connects the positive reception John, not Jesus, received from prostitutes. And no one accuses Jesus of any sexual misconduct, nor, by the way, do I see any necessary reason to take the anointing woman of Luke 7:36 following to be a prostitute. Women can become sinners in a variety of ways, not just sexually. Our authors continue. Perhaps the thing that is most surprising is that Jesus was accompanied by both men and women. But what, however, does accompanied mean? It's not clear to me, for example, that the women were overnighting with Jesus and his merry men. I find it more likely that the women may have accompanied him to one event or another, as did crowds, but then they returned to their homes at night. That they came with him and many others on his final trip to Jerusalem is nothing out of the ordinary, as they were part of a general group of pilgrims. Next, I was struck by the claim that, quote, an external observer might very well have assumed that the women traveling with Jesus and the 12 were serving as slaves in every respect. I read that 3 times, slaves in every respect. And this may have given rise to accusations of prostitution. But there weren't accusations of prostitution. There's just accusation of hanging out with sinners. I take the phrase slaves in every respect to mean sexual services as well as menial tasks. And that would be shocking, given that the tradition also includes married women like the wife of Zebedee in Matthew and Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward in Luke, in the entourage. So where are the accusations of misbehaving sexually? And why would they see the women in the role of slaves, especially if they're in a patronage capacity? And if people did see the women in the role of slaves, what were they imagining those women were doing? More, were there slaves among Jesus' initial followers? Our authors raise the subject, but don't address it in any full detail. And then again, if so, how would we know? And on that note, what should we make of Jesus commending the attitude of being slaves? On the other hand, the authors propose Jesus himself practiced celibacy, but this was not a lifestyle that he advocated for his followers, even though they were supposed to be willing to abandon everything, including family. Peter, for example, was married and lived with his family in Capernaum. Well, it seems to me more likely both that Jesus endorsed celibacy, I agree here, and he expected the same continence from his immediate followers. The women and the men in the entourage, as far as we can tell, are all without spousal accompaniment. We know that Peter was married, but since the Gospels record nothing about his wife, we could more easily surmise that she was either dead or that she and Peter came to have a non-sexual marriage. And that non-sexual marriage would be consistent with Luke 14:26. Jesus claimed that whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife, and children and brothers and sisters, and yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. And that would also be consistent with Paul's reference to Peter's sister wife. Granted, Luke may have added the reference to wife. Matthew 19:29 reads, and everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or fields will receive 100-fold, and so on. So Matthew doesn't have the reference to wife. However, I think it just as likely that Luke brings out the meaning of Matthew's Semitic idiom. Matthew's exhortation begins not with father and mother, but oddly, at least to my ears, with houses. However, in Hebrew, house, bayit, is an idiom for one's wife. Thus, on the double subject of sexual relations and Jesus' afamilial ethos, might the authors develop their view as Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet in these terms? How, for example, would a commendation of sexual relations with the attendant possibility of children fit within an apocalyptic framework? And finally, on source criticism, and here again, Tobias has already addressed the subject briefly. Our authors accept, although cautiously, and they don't detail it, the criteria of multiple attestation, because they do cite such and such is seen in multiple sources, and dissimilarity for determining what materials can be attributed to the historical Jesus. They accept the existence of a Q source or something like it. They see Luke as writing independently of Matthew, and they see John as containing, at least regarding the words attributed to Jesus, much later and non-historical material. I'm increasingly becoming a Q skeptic, even as I am increasingly convinced that Luke had access to both Mark and Matthew and that John had access to all three synoptics. Thus, I'm less sanguine than our authors about the historicity of several of the events or details that they find to have historical grounding. And here are just a few of the things that I'd really like to discuss more. Regarding the multiply attested claim that Jesus was of Davidic descent, the authors propose contemporary opponents could easily have disproved the claim had it been false. Well, how so? Because there weren't any lists, and the genealogies Matthew and Luke offered don't agree. And we're centuries past David, presuming there was a David in the first place, and he was multiply married and had lots of kids. So why not see the claim for Davidic descent as part of the same legendary material represented by the claims of virginal conception or astrological marvels? 2, our authors state, it is clear that Jesus too was troubled by some aspects of the temple services as he physically assaulted the sellers and the money changers who worked there. However, the prediction of a new temple bolstered by Ezekiel's vision was already in place, and we know that from the Dead Sea Scrolls, among other texts. The need for a new temple need not indicate that there was something wrong with the services the temple offered. And if Jesus did see something troubling, the point seems to have been missed by his followers, because Paul recognizes the value of temple worship, latreia, that's Romans, and Acts depicts his followers still worshiping in the temple. So what exactly was the problem with the temple? 3, after detailing Jesus' program as radical and subversive in nature, because family was unimportant, the first would be last, the temple would fall, and the Son of Man would come on the clouds of heaven, the authors conclude that this radical, uncompromising element made the authorities nervous and ultimately led to his execution. But I don't see why. If the issue were the radical program, why didn't the authorities round up his followers as well? The problem, it seems to me, is not that Jesus was anti-family or even his prediction that the Son of Man would arrive on the clouds. The problem seems to be that the people wanted to make him king, as the Titulus suggests and as John 6 insists. The problem seems less to be what Jesus said and did than what people thought of him. And here I'm following the work of Paula Fredrickson. The same situation that, according to Josephus, led to Herod Antipas's preemptive strike against John the Immerser. Indeed, on page 66, the authors write, the fact that he was executed for treason suggests that Jesus was regarded as a political instigator of rebellion. So how does this political instigation of rebellion relate to questions of this quote unquote radical program? 4, the authors conclude that in Jesus' world, of course, it is only the man who can initiate a divorce, and therefore Mark's including the injunction against a wife divorcing her husband, that's Mark 10:12, is an accommodation to Roman, not Jewish law. Yet Josephus here, Antiquities 15 on women in the Herodian household, albeit begrudgingly, admits that Jewish women did divorce their husbands. Well, I'm less interested in the legal debates, including the Nachal Hever papyri, which enter into the question about whether women can divorce or not, as I am in the relationship between the forbidding of divorce and Jesus' afamilial ethos. So to the authors, how do you think marriage among Jesus' followers worked in process? If the ethos is to deny the family, but on the other hand, you can't get divorced, how do these two things fit together? And finally, and this may anticipate James's comments, I have not seen them, I'm in sympathy with the argument of James Crossley, unless he's changed his mind, and others, that the empty tomb story is late, not only both on the grounds that Paul makes no mention of it, okay, it's an argument from silence, but really, and on account of the many legendary elements that the accounts contain, but also because it assures a resurrected body rather than something detached from the physical, which is what Paul seems to suggest in 1 Corinthians, and B, it gives the hero an honorable burial rather than having the faithful think his corpse was tossed into a lime pit. The Johannine account of Mary and Jesus is also a nice example of the Hellenistic romance. So what exactly prompts the claim to historicity of the empty tomb story? Well, there's much more content to be praised and many more subjects to be discussed. The volume was a joy to read. And I think Tobias is right. We haven't had a recent major book that looks at the entire swath of historical Jesus material. Although, folks, you could have put in a chapter on parables. So my thanks to the authors and to Gabriella for the invitation to participate in this conversation.
Thank you very much, Jay, for your comments. And now, James Crossley from St. Mary's University, London, is your turn.
Thank you. Well, I'm very pleased to review Cecilia and Tobias's new book, and it's one of those situations where I didn't have all that much with which I disagree. Not without their own helpful spin on certain issues. I think this story of the prophet who failed, to give the nod to the Swedish title I wish they'd kept, is a fair representation of mainstream scholarly opinion on a controversial subject in the public domain, as I'm sure they both appreciate. But a panel review would not be a review if I just agreed with everything. We want some discussion. So my questions, therefore, are really over points of detail in the hope of sparking some debate. And I really just want to look at 3 points. First, an issue where I don't think there is substantive disagreement. Second, an issue where I think there might be. And third, an issue which may have wider ramifications for the field. Now, I agree quite strongly with Cecilia and Tobias on their general stance on Jesus and purity laws. I also agree with their general understanding of hand washing and how a dispute over hand washing, rather than a rejection or prioritizing of purity and food laws as a concept, underpins the controversy in Mark 7:1 through to 23. And here I guess I would just be tweaking their argument with particular reference to Mark's presentation of Jesus. They note that the famous argument concerning Mark 7:15 is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile, and how Mark interprets it by claiming all foods are clean in verse 17. They note that the reference to food refers to what is eaten and not to unclean animals that are prohibited in Leviticus 11. Yet when Matthew incorporates the passage, he omits this comment, likely, they argue, because he disagrees with Mark. Instead, they claim, while Mark's explanatory comment is in line with Jesus saying he goes a step further than Jesus, whilst Jesus does reject the idea that eating ritually impure food defiles a person, that's not the same as saying that all food is clean. While I think their explanation with regards to the historical Jesus critiquing hand washing is right, and while I also agree that much of Mark 7:1 through to 23 has been worked over editorially, or whatever stage of transmission, I think we can extend what they argue to the overarching argument of Mark 7:1 through to 23 itself, Mark sets out a clear context for interpreting verses 15 and 19, with the repeated contrast between tradition, Mark's term, and biblical commandments in Mark 7, 1 through to 13, where human tradition or the tradition of the elders occurs 6 times. Mark elaborates more precisely on the content of this tradition, such as washing with the hand in the shape of the fist, the infamous pugme, immersing of cups, pitchers, bronze kettles, and dining couches, and then on to Corban. I would argue that not only Mark 7:15, but Mark 7:19 continues the construction of the biblical commandments versus the tradition theme. And this is what Matthew 15:20 makes clear. Mark's detailed editorial aside in the first 5 verses makes the context explicit by giving precise examples of tradition, namely hand washing tradition or related to it. The inclusion of with the fist refers to the practice of the minimal amount of water required for hand washing to cover enough of the hand for purification. Mark further explains a number of related table purity traditions, including Mark 7 verse 4, and the tradition of Pharisees immersing themselves on return from the market, the immersion of cups, pitchers, bronze kettles, which were developments of precise laws in Leviticus 11:15 to be interpreted generally, at least by the time of the Mishnah, with reference to relevant utensils. The variant reading and dining couches was part of the interpretation of Leviticus 11 and 15, and the immersion of reclining couches as discussed in rabbinic law. Mark certainly reported these traditions in an exaggerated way for a Gentile audience, but on the practices themselves, he's done so very precisely. Mark 7, 1 through to 5 records these traditions because they relate to the discussion of the transmission of impurity and the transmission of impurity from hands to food to eater, which, as discussed in detail in rabbinic literature, also involves bodily immersion, where hands still remain especially susceptible to impurity. Thus, this precise context provided by Mark sheds further light on the saying, there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile, and the cleansing of all foods clean, or the cleansing of all food, sorry. Mark's Jesus is critiquing the transmission of impurity from hands to the insides, and from the perspective of all foods permitted to eat in the Torah, well, they could be eaten. Did Jesus engage in such a dispute? God knows. But such a legal dispute be one among many in early Judaism. But I think this is important for understanding the historical Jesus in general terms. If Mark 7, 1 through to 23 is no longer the glaring example of Jesus opposing the law, if the synoptics only present Jesus engaging in conventional disputes over interpretation, if Paul struggled with issues of non-observance more generally but could not find precedent in Jesus, and if John's gospel introduced the possibility of Jesus advocating non-observance, see John 5, 1 through to 18, then the most likely conclusion is the one that comes through in this book. The idea of Jesus as accepting non-observance, and ideas about non-observance more generally are ideas that are not from the historical Jesus, but later. Concerning the discussion of Jesus as Son of Man, I think I'd have some reservations about whether the apocalyptic or messianic titular version is likely to go back to the historical Jesus. Cecilia and Tobias note the crucial instance of Mark 13, which they describe not unreasonably as the most apocalyptic portion of Mark's gospel, where the Son of Man is a heavenly figure, in Mark 13, 24 through to 27. They argue that the description of the Son of Man in verses 24 through to 27 and his coming to gather his elect at end times fits well with the apocalyptic message that Jesus preached, followed by an outlining of the possible messianic interpretations available to Jesus. They add that his coming would take place when the kingdom of God came with power. By contrast, they argue, those statements in Mark's gospel about how the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, Mark 2:10, and the Lord of the Sabbath, Mark 2:28, are statements which certainly do hint at the Messiah's power and dominion, but are unlikely to have been uttered by the historical Jesus. Indeed, they argue, it's clear from the Gospels that an increasing number of statements in which Jesus is identified as the Son of Man, not just in some coming age, but even during his earthly life, are later fabrications, adding the question, is it possible that at first the Son of Man did not refer to Jesus at all, but rather to some other saviour figure? Now, I'd like to make the case for the tradition Cecilia and Tobias critique, namely the argument that it's more likely that the mundane use of Son of Man, minus the capital letters, so to speak, reflects the historical Jesus, or near as damn it. The two key examples of Jesus as the Danielic Son of Man, with capital letters, with the clouds of heaven, are in Mark 13:26 and Mark 14:62. Mark 14:62 occurs in the historically dubious trial scene, where it's not entirely clear how it would have been possible to pass on a tradition of Jesus as the Danielic Son of Man. Mark 13:26 is also located in a text which looks as if it includes significant issues likely to be live later than the historical Jesus. As we know, Mark 13 is an unusually lengthy eschatological discourse, but does not mention the popular term Kingdom of God, which should raise some suspicions. Mark 13 further reflects later known developments. For example, being beaten in synagogues and being brought before governors and kings in verse 9 is something described as happening elsewhere in the later first century movement. Taking the gospel to the nations in 13 verse 10 is likely to be a development after the historical Jesus. The prediction of the abomination of desolation in 13 verse 14 is not found elsewhere in the synoptic tradition, other than the Matthean parallel, which we might expect had the historical Jesus, or indeed earlier tradition, made such a claim. The Markan Jesus' reference to himself as the Son in verse 32 is likewise only used in explicit self-reference in Mark 13. I'm not sure the references in 12:6 and 14:62 are that explicit, certainly not self-reference. And its use of self-reference is at the beginning of a rapidly increasing tradition taken up with enthusiasm in John's Gospel. The use of the term the Son in Mark 13:32 looks then like it belongs to a developing tradition and not from the historical Jesus. And the point of this little detour, I think, is that this is a with the general frame of reference, hence the general contextualization given in verse 27. And this reading is supported by Matthew and Luke dropping the general frame of reference in Mark 2:27 and making sure that the Son of Man, presumably with capital letters, is a title for Jesus alone. Furthermore, the sentiment of justifying Sabbath practice in terms of being made for humanity was something known. So this is a familiar turn of phrase, I think. Now, I can't prove whether this saying does or does not go back to the historical Jesus, but I would say there's a stronger case that it plausibly could reflect the time of the historical Jesus, more so than the Son of Man coming on the Danielic clouds of heaven, which has more obvious signs, I would suggest, of development in ideas post-historical Jesus. Now, I'm going to finish with the empty tomb, and AJ may or may not be pleased to know that I've not really changed my mind on this, or on anything probably. The last issue is perhaps the trickiest one for New Testament scholarship. I still think it is the empty tomb and resurrection. Cecilia and Tobias suggest that the empty tomb and resurrection narratives are plausibly based on some historical event. They add that an author who had free reign entirely is hardly likely to have come up with the idea of having a group of women discover the tomb, and that it would have been more useful to have emphasized the priority of the 12 being first at the tomb to verify that it was empty, an argument which is supported, for instance, by John's treatment. They point to one plausible scenario, namely that a few of the female supporters claim to have discovered that the tomb was empty early on, though Cecilia and Tobias carefully qualify this with the statement whether because the body had been moved or they had gone to the wrong tomb for some other reasons we cannot know, and that after this there followed a fairly short period of uncertainty and confusion. Then the inner circle had visions, they argue, which they interpreted to mean that Jesus was no longer dead, and concluded the reasons for the tomb was empty was that God had risen him. Now, I appreciate the carefulness of Cecilia and Tobias's wording. But I still think the stories of the empty tomb and resurrection do not give us this sort of access to history. While I appreciate that this is not precisely their point, we should remember that Mark does not present us with women as the first witnesses to the empty tomb, not technically, but rather an angelic man. Okay, it might be countered that Mark added this and other details to get around the alleged problem of women being the first witnesses. But were women such a cultural problem, and thus to the extent of being unlikely for someone to make up their appearance in the story? Well, I'm not sure this argument holds. Women were already given relatively prominent, comparatively prominent roles in Jesus' group, at least according to Mark, and this could have made their testimony more acceptable for some. Mark, in fact, stresses their importance just prior to the crucifixion, when the men had to scatter. Indeed, when the men scattered, Mark was left in his narrative with women he obviously valued to some degree, and so the presence of women was not necessarily a problem for Mark. And even if we should not over-liberalize the ancient world, other Jewish texts had comparatively prominent roles for women, and Jews could and did write stories about women, such as Esther and Judith, who played much more prominent roles than some might expect in certain contexts. So could not the early followers of Jesus after his death have done the same and write stories about heroic women in a given context? Theoretically, yes. Culturally, plausible. Could other followers have taken a more misogynistic line? No doubt, as Cecilia and Tobias imply. Could both tendencies have existed within this movement? Theoretically, yes. What we are left with as our primary evidence for the empty tomb is the very early 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, assuming it assumed the raised Jesus left an empty tomb, and Mark 16, 1-8, a story about the massive store on the way with an angelic man explaining to the women to go tell the disciples that Jesus is going ahead of them to Galilee, and the women fleeing and telling no one because they were afraid, which could equally be read as an explanation for why no one knew where this empty tomb was. And that's it. This is not enough to work with for historical reconstruction, in my opinion, and we should treat it like we would treat any other spectacular origin story of any other religious movement. And I think I'd go further than Cecilia and Tobias and argue that if this is all we have, then we should abandon the quest for the empty tomb and focus more on what Cecilia and Tobias really did here, explaining what the first followers were doing with their beliefs and interpretations of their visions as this movement began to spread. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I have decided to do my presentation in the form of a PowerPoint, so I'm sharing my screen. Okay. So let me first of all to express all my appreciation to the authors for the very important publication. This book is at the same time a very readable textbook and a piece of original scholarship that guide us to understand what we know now about the historical Jesus. It does it with much clarity, methodological soundness, and careful attention to the latest development of the research in the field. The book also is important not only for the answers it provides, but for the many questions it raises. As we all know, the recovery of historical Jesus is a slow, patient, and even very painful process of going backwards from the Jesus we know to the Jesus of history, which implies the effort to remove layer after layer all the many superstructures that have accumulated over the centuries. The starting point can only be the Jesus that everybody knows, which is not the historical Jesus and not even the Jesus of the Gospels. Is the Jesus of Western tradition, the one that I have called the great white male chief of Western tradition, because centuries of reinterpretation of Jesus in a male-dominated society and in a colonial setting have transformed Jesus into the icon and the champion on white and male supremacy. I wish the authors had devoted small chapters at the beginning of their book also to these issues, but to this issue that should not be ignored and cannot longer be ignored, just to show how, in order to recover the historical Jesus, we have also to address the problem of this kind of Jesus, that is the dominant Jesus that is known by everybody. So this gendered, racialized, whitewashed Jesus has nothing to do with the historical Jesus. And so, who was the historical Jesus? Next, we have the Jesus of the Gospels, or better, the Jesus of the Synoptics, which is an eschatological Messiah, the fulfillment of all expectations, of all the many expectations in Second Temple Judaism, as provided by the reference to the terms Son of Man, Son of David, even the reference to some legends related to Melchizedek, prophetic legends, etc. What we have in the Synoptics is a clear understanding of who Jesus was. The idea of the two comings of the Messiah, the first coming in which Jesus manifested himself as the Savior who has authority on earth to forgive sins, and a second coming in which Jesus will come back as the final judge in the last judgment. We usually say that this is a reference to Daniel, but it's not a reference to Daniel, because in Daniel, Jesus is not the Messiah is not the judge. This is a reference to Enoch. This is a reference to the parables of Enoch, to nothing else. Not to Daniel, because Daniel has nothing to do with the Son of Man as the judge. So the exalted Jesus of the Synoptics has the advantage of being a clear Jesus, a Jesus, an eschatological Messiah who came on earth as the forgiver of sins and will come back as the judge. In this sense, is closer to the Synoptics, and but we know also that this is not the historical Jesus. The historical Jesus is something else. And this is the work that very well the authors are doing in their work. To go backwards from the white male chief of the tradition and exalted Christ of the Gospels to the historical Jesus. What is the conclusion? And I must say that I agree on most of the conclusions. First of all, on the fact that Jesus was a Jew and a law-observant Jew, not an apostate, and not even an ordinary Jew, because there was nothing like an ordinary Jew or a Jew like everybody else. And so I think that the book addresses the real question, which is not about the Jewishness of Jesus, but about what kind of Jew Jesus was, because this is the real historical problem. And the answer is an apocalyptic prophet, a healer, a preacher, a former disciple of John the Baptist. I particularly appreciate the abandonment of any opposition between the apocalyptic and the non-apocalyptic Jesus. I found this is particularly helpful. For 2 centuries, we scholars of the historical Jesus have divided ourselves between those who believe that Jesus was apocalyptic and those who believe he was not apocalyptic. I think that this is time that we overcome this dichotomy. And the authors did very well by showing that Jesus completely shared the apocalyptic idea that this world was dominated by evil, the idea of a superhuman origin of evil, the idea of a cosmic rebellion against God, but at the same time that his message about the coming of the kingdom of God had very strong political and religious implications, that his fight was both against evil forces, angelic forces, and human forces, and that unlike some contemporary apocalyptic movements, the Jesus movement was not merely a movement of spiritual renewal, it called for special readiness and action. I found it particularly useful. What I want to stress in my response is the question that is raised in the book about the messianship of Jesus, which is also something that James had mentioned before. Did Jesus, when announcing the coming of the Messiah, the Son of Man, the apocalyptic judge, was he referring to himself or was he referring to somebody else? Because I think this is a very important question. Of course, we cannot know for sure, but I appreciated the fact that the authors are saying that there are several factors that point to the conclusion that at the very least, Jesus did not miss the possibility that he was Israel's Messiah. And there are many elements that lead to this kind of conclusion that there was some messianic claim from Jesus, even though it's difficult to define exactly the feature of the messianic self-consciousness of Jesus. In particular, it is hard to explain many of the major events of the last week in Jerusalem without considering some kind of messianic flavor. The entrance in Jerusalem, the so-called cleansing of the temple, the Last Supper. I would have included personally also a reference to the anointing at Bethany, which I think is another event that should be taken quite seriously from the historical point of view in order to understand the messianic expectations related to Jesus and his movement. Of course, this doesn't mean that Jesus believed that he was the Son of Man, but certainly his movement became a messianic movement, while at the beginning, my impression is that at the beginning it was not, because according to the gospel, the first message of Jesus is identical to the message of John the Baptist, which doesn't imply any reference to the Messiah. And even in the prayer of our Father, there is no expectation of a Messiah. The expectation is the coming of a kingdom, not the coming of the Messiah. So I agree with the conclusion that Jesus was a sort of prophetic Messiah, like Theudas of the Egyptian prophet. But nonetheless, I still wonder how it's possible that this kind of apocalyptic prophet led to the interpretation of the synoptic of Jesus as the exalted Christ. So I think that once we have moved backwards from the Jesus of the Gospels to the historical Jesus, we have also the responsibility to explain how it was possible to move from the historical Jesus to the exalted Christ. So, and I repeat, the problem is not only to go back methodologically from the Jesus we know to the historical Jesus, but also to explain conceptually how we went from the historical Jesus to the exalted Christ. The book tried to solve the problem by stressing that between the historical Jesus and the Jesus of the synoptic is the experience of the risen Christ. the visions of the risen Christ and the discovery of the empty tomb. And here I agree with AJ and James. I'm not completely satisfied with this explanation, because it seems almost that the mystical experience of the resurrection or the experience of the empty tomb was what produced the change from the apocalyptic prophet to B, the exalted Christ. And with Daniel Boyarin, I don't see this as the cause, but as the result. As he says, exaltation and resurrection experiences are a product of the narrative, not a cause of it. I do not deny the reality of mystical experiences, but people see and believe what they expect to see and believe. So there must have been something in the message of historical Jesus that allowed his disciples to believe in his resurrection and to make sense in his death. So I think we have to explain, it doesn't mean that Jesus, the historical Jesus, was the Jesus of the synoptics, but we have to explain what made it possible for the disciples of Jesus to move from the historical Jesus to the exalted Christ that they presented in their works. And I think that we should pay a little bit more attention to the problem of forgiveness of sins. On page 176, he said that the statement that the Son of Man, that Jesus had some authority on earth to forgive sins, was an addition by early Christ believers, but the work does not explain why there is this kind of. I found this statement a little bit surprising, since the book recognized that the historical Jesus preached about a merciful God who forgave sins. So there is a strong emphasis on forgiveness of Jesus and repentance in the teaching of Jesus. And also that Jesus, as a healer, saw a link between forgiveness and healing. Besides, the concept of forgiveness of sins is well attested in the early apocalyptic traditions. Is already present in chapter 50-51 of the book of Parables of Enoch. So it's not something that was introduced into the conversation into the figure of the Son of Man by the authors of the Gospels. It was something that already belonged to the apocalyptic tradition. And this makes more likely that this element was also understood and taken by Jesus, and so makes less likely that this was a later addition. My idea is that if Jesus as a healer was believed that he was already given by God some messianic authority to forgive, which doesn't mean necessarily that Jesus understood himself as the future eschatological judge, but Jesus could have understood himself as an apocalyptic prophet, somebody that was fighting against the forces of evil, also as somebody that was given some authority to forgive sins as an apocalyptic prophet. And this could have provided the key to overcome the trauma of the failure and led to interpret even his death as a step toward that goal. If the death of Jesus was understood for forgiveness of sins, is because the idea of forgiveness of sins was already well established in the community, not the opposite, at least in my opinion. So my conclusion is that I completely agree on the the way in which Jesus is presented in the book of Cecilia and Tobias as a Jewish apocalyptic prophet, in which both aspects of social reform and deliverance from evil are combined and should not be separated. A Jewish apocalyptic prophet that also was believed to have power to overcome the forces of evil, the cosmic forces of evil, and was given some authority to forgive sins. And this was the reason of his mission, the kind of mission then his disciples believed to continue through baptism. And this element was the element that make it possible to understand his death not as a failure, but as a step in the process of liberation from social injustice and sin, and led to his identification with the eschatological Son of Man that, according to the tradition of Enoch, was believed as the one that would come at the end of time as the final judge. Thank you. And now I think we have time for a first round of responses by Cecilia and Tobias. Before opening the conversation, we have almost 1 hour for a conversation also with many people that have joined our meeting. What is the order?
Gabriele, I think we decided to take a few minute break.
Let's have a couple of minutes break to stretch our legs and our arms, and then we'll be back in 2-3 minutes at the most. So welcome back to everybody, to our speakers, and to all people that are attending our session. I think we had some very interesting remarks, and we are ready for beginning our conversation. We have 45 minutes for our conversation. It will start from Cecilia and Tobias, so some first remarks from Tobias, from Cecilia and Tobias. And then we would like to invite our attendees, some of our attendees, to join us in the panel. Please use the raise hand feature if you like to be included in the conversation. So, Cecilia, you are the first.
Well, first, thank you all for your great comments and interesting and a bit challenging questions. And I'm happy to see that we sort of agree on the basic reconstruction of Jesus as an apocalyptic preacher and healer, an itinerant leader who is traveling around with an entourage and proclaiming the imminent coming of the kingdom or the God's reign. So we agree on a lot, and I thank you kindly for those positive words that you said about the book. And then there are other issues where we partly agree or where we disagree. So that's where we're gonna focus most of the attention to, and we'll try to be fairly brief, so there will be time left over for a general discussion. So perhaps we won't be able to address all the questions, but we will do an overall response, and then perhaps we can come back to some of the detailed questions that you had. So I would start with AJ's. We'll follow sort of the order that you gave your responses. On your first point there on doing history, and you say that there's been pushback of some scholars on this sort of secular approach, and you ask if we are promoting Western hegemonic values. Well, so we'll start there. This is a huge question, and we could spend a lot of time on these questions, but I will be very brief. So my point is that when it comes to views on the Bible, there is also a huge variety in the Western world and also among Christians in general. So there is a variety everywhere. And concerning the possible retrojection of whiteness, and I take it Christian whiteness, into biblical texts, I would think that this is less of a problem today compared to early scholarship, which read the text through Christian, male, and European lenses. I don't say that it's not there, but at least we try to understand Jesus in his Jewish milieu in the time of Roman occupation and as a Jew among Jews from birth to death. So we make more of an effort to understand the historical context today, I think, which ties into Gabriella's suggestion that we should have had a chapter on the history of scholarship. Yeah, we could have. It's such a big topic that eventually we decided not to, just to keep the book sort of in a limited extent. And there are other books that does this very nicely. So, but how does our own social location influence the approach we take and the conclusions we draw? Well, obviously, good question, enormously. So you cannot remove yourself from your social location. And of course, I do the work I do because of my training. and because I'm interested in these particular questions. So we have long left the idea that there is something like a neutral, objective, unbiased scholarship. There is none. So we're very much aware of the importance of one's personality, background, identity, life experience, kind of education, and so on. And this doesn't influence my research only, but it's the very reason for the outcome of my research. So, but it's the same for everyone. And it's important to know your social location wherever you are. But we subscribe to certain common principles that come with a discipline, which is why we can debate our interpretation of the historical Jesus with each other. Otherwise, we would simply say, well, you have your views and I have mine, and we wouldn't be able to discuss the issues any further. So we do have a secular historical critical perspective in line with regular historical research into any period of time. So in contrast to the common belief of most Christians in the whole world, Western countries and elsewhere, we won't explain any events, as we pointed out, involving Jesus as caused by a god or gods, by Zeus or Adonai, or demons, angels, or even evil powers. I mean, we could do it, but then we wouldn't be doing historical research any longer. So then we would be doing something else. So that's sort of our approach, and we're very open with this. Should we continue with AJ's, Tobias?
Yeah, sure. Also appreciate very much the questions here, and there were so many things we would like to address, but as Cecilia said, we have to select a few of them. And I think the next question that you asked, Amy Jill, about the content of the gospel, I take that to mean not the gospel writings, but the message of Jesus, and the recipient of that gospel, who were these poor people, and what was the content of this message apart from the claim that the world was going to end. I think maybe we should have been a little more clear there about, I think we used that phrase a couple of times, the end of the world. Maybe we should have stressed that it's not necessary, it's not really the end of the world, it's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the present age, of the present conditions. So it's rather the transformation, a radical change of the world. Maybe that we should have stressed that more clearly, because if it's not really the end of the world, if it's not the end of all that we know about the world, there may still be families, for example, when the kingdom of God arrives, that there may still be people will be eating, for example, just that there will be an abundance of food and drink. People will live well, for hundreds of years, or maybe forever. This is the kind of reasoning and images that we find in many apocalyptic writings. So maybe we should. I think that's something like that is what Jesus had in mind. And if that is the case, it's not really necessary to put this to make this strict distinction or contradiction between apocalyptic prophecy and, well, social justice or whatever. I think Gabriele also went into this, and I think I'm quite sympathetic to what you said there, Gabriele, that we shouldn't pitch the apocalyptic vision of Jesus against the idea of social reform. And there are certainly quite a number of apocalyptic prophets, for example, John the Baptist, who seems to have had some kind of social reform program in mind as a preparation for the inbreaking of God's rule or God's kingdom. So these poor people, who were they? Well, that's a good question. I think there were people on the margins then, just like there are now in every society. I mean, Cecilia and I live in a very developed welfare society, but we have people on the margins. We have beggars, we have everything here. And I suppose there were in ancient Israel as well, perhaps people who were the casualties of the very heavy taxation, who had lost their farms and so on, would have felt that this was good news to them. And maybe this is the point of Jesus' message, or rather the premise on which it was successful, that it was felt to be appealing. It was felt to be meaningful. It was felt to give hope to these people. Just like, for example, Theudas and the Egyptian prophets, their message really, it seems to have been appealing to the masses, but it's quite hard to make out why. But people followed them. So there must have been some charismatic aura around the proclamation of this message. So whether it was or was not in fact beneficial to these people, maybe is a slightly different question. I think it links into another question that you asked, and that's the question about the relationship between Jesus' radical program and his execution. How do these radical ideas of Jesus lead to his execution? And I think we essentially agree with you that on their own, these ideas or even this proclamation could not have led up to Jesus' execution. So what led up to Jesus' execution was more or less the Roman authorities' perception of the crowd's perception of what Jesus could and would accomplish. So I think we are really on the same page there. Okay, Cecilia, would you like to take over?
Continue with people on the margin, namely prostitutes, that AJ also asked about. We say that they may have been represented in the Jesus movement, just like tax collectors and other sinners. And we didn't mean, you asked how were they part of the group, and I agree that they weren't within the we don't hear about any prostitutes following Jesus. It's rather they would be there among the wider circle of supporters. I think we should have made that more clear. And also you wonder, how did they travel? How did Jesus travel with his company of men and women? Luke is saying that they traveled together. How was that possible at this time? And we point to the pilgrimage travels where big groups of people from the villages would be traveling, men and women together. And you point out that that's a very different situation than traveling a group of people with a leader like that. And you say perhaps the women, or you assume that the women would travel with them during the day, but then return to their homes at night, and that's possible. But then we do have the Luke saying that they traveled together, and I think we should also take into account that this was quite a radical group, and they wouldn't adhere to all the social norms, I think, even though it would have been unusual. And then the reason why we mention slaves is that perhaps other outsiders who would see this group might have assumed that they were traveling with slaves. We don't say that they included slaves. And you bring up that there were no accusations of prostitution, right? So we slipped there. Our next edition will be qualified, and we'll correct that. But there are sexual the policies on sexual relations seem to have been very strict, and we do have Jesus' very stringent prohibition against divorce, and the main point being that you're not allowed to remarry, you're not allowed to have sexual relations with anyone else than your first wife, your only wife. You can't divorce, you can't leave her. And that sounds a bit like a contradiction to his message about hating your family. And you bring that up. How are we to understand this message about leaving hating? You quote it, whoever comes to me does not hate father and mother, wife or children, brothers and sisters, and so on, cannot be my disciple. And this seems a bit contradictory to the information we also get that he's curing Peter's mother-in-law. So apparently Peter is still living with his family. And what about Jesus? Well, we know about tension and conflict early on in his ministry with his family, but then later, James, his brother, is the leader of the new congregation in Jerusalem. So we would take the harsh demands on discipleship, not perhaps too literally, but that disciples should be ready to leave everything for the kingdom and follow Jesus. And of course, some of them did when they traveled around, and then they might go home for a while, but then they were out traveling again, putting Jesus' movement, preparing for the kingdom first. And how did Peter and his wife live together? Well, it's hard to, of course, to know, but Paul in 1 Corinthians 9 says that he was traveling together with his wife, and so was James. So they didn't give up on their marriages, it seems. So, but this is a fascinating area, and of course we're speculating about how they actually, in practical terms, worked out the living arrangements out. So we're speculating based on the evidence we have. So thank you.
Is it to leave at least 30 minutes for general conversation? So if you could just wrap up some points in general, and then you can go back to other elements.
Okay. What we could, Son of Man. So we have these traditions about Jesus saying, talking about the Son of Man in humble terms and as an exalted Son of Man. And yeah, here we disagree then with James. He points out that Mark 13 doesn't mention the kingdom of God, but that connection is made elsewhere. So we do think that both aspects go back to Jesus. Perhaps you should say something about forgiveness, Tobias. That was a
yes, absolutely. I'm very glad you brought this up, and I think what Gabriele said about forgiveness, and especially the claim in Mark 2:10 about the Son of Man having authority to forgive sins, and what James brought up about the Son of Man as Lord of the Sabbath in the same chapter of Mark. I think these two sayings belong together, actually. They belong to the same context. They use expressions that are more or less synonymous: to have authority and to be Lord over something. If you check the Greek and you compare it to the Septuagint, and especially the versions of the book of Daniel, you will find that these are more or less synonymous expressions. And I think they're also linked on the textual level. So when Jesus says there in Mark 2:28, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath, he is actually pointing back to his status as having authority to forgive sins. So I think both of these are quite important. And to begin with the statement on forgiveness of sins, well, it must have been my excessive humility that made us forget to put in a reference to my 2012 book on Jesus and the forgiveness of sins, which has all the answers to your questions there, Gabriele. In essence, we think that Jesus did proclaim forgiveness, as you spotted there, in a prophetic way, but that precise statement in 2:10 is very awkward, and that's for several reasons. I don't think I have time to go into them, but actually, it's the precise formulation of this as a Son of Man saying that is problematic here. And then that also makes, I think, 2:28 about the Lord of the Sabbaths a little suspicious because of the close links to 2:10. I'm not really sure. I know this generic interpretation that you offer, James, that it means that a human being is Lord over the Sabbath. I think that Daniel Boyarin's interpretation of the link between 2:27 and 2:28 is more correct there. What 2:27 is saying that the Sabbath belongs to the human realm, over which the Danielic Son of Man has been granted authority. Because the language even in 2:28 is very Danielic. So, well, you said, James, you can't prove this saying if it goes back to the historical Jesus or not. So unfortunately, we cannot prove anything either, but the evidence seems to be weighing over on the other side to us. And then to move into Gabriele's argument there about the resurrection faith, yes, of course, I think we agree that resurrection faith didn't appear out of the blue, as it were. There must have been something in Jesus' ministry, in his message proclamation, that was seminal to these visions. Maybe I'm a little skeptical about the claim that people see what they expect to see, because if you look to this classic investigation by Festing and others that we refer to, when prophecy fails, this religious movement in Chicago, I think it was in the 1950s, they expected to see a great flood, they expected to see spaceships, and they didn't see anything of it. And no one else did see anything of it, but they started to see other things. They started to see strange faces of aliens among ordinary people and so on. So maybe, yeah, of course, forgiveness could be the key or the link between the historical Jesus and resurrection. But if that were the link, isn't it a little surprising that it's among the Gospels, for example, it's only Matthew that explicitly says that Jesus dies for the forgiveness of sins? And if you look at Paul, for example, he doesn't normally use that language. Why couldn't the expectation of the Son of Man coming with the clouds be that link? Why couldn't the enthronement of Jesus as king in Jerusalem be that link? Nothing of this happened, so they started to see the risen and glorified Jesus. Yeah, do we have time to say anything about the empty tomb?
Yes, just quickly, because we have people that want to, or just wait one moment. Okay, let's cover some more, because I see that Federico or Paolo Fredrickson wants to say something. Okay? And there are others that are coming. Federico. Unmute your
okay, fine. Oh, yes. But first of all, let me express my gratitude because I loved your book and I completely agree on most things you say. So I have no major points to make, but there is one small thing that puzzled me, and I would like you to clarify. On page 92, you express your skepticism that John the Baptist could ever have wondered about Jesus being the coming one he expected. for the coming one was a divine judge, and Jesus was obviously not. Now, I do completely agree with this judgment, but then I find it strange that you nonetheless seem to consider John's question to be somehow historical. For you write that John really did wonder about the role of Jesus. And you seem to think so because the question goes against the description of John acknowledging Jesus as the Messiah in the baptism narratives. Now, aside from the fact that in Q and Mark, it is not that evident that John recognizes Jesus as the Messiah, as in Matthew, I actually don't think that John's question in Q expresses doubt or skepticism about Jesus. In my opinion, if we consider the pericope within the argumentative flow of the first part of Q, it is impossible to understand John's question as skeptical, because for Q, John is a very authoritative character, and the reliability of his point of view is fundamental to the rhetorical agenda of Q. So if John's point of view were unreliable, this would have serious consequences for the demonstration of Jesus' identity as the coming one. So I believe that John's question should not be interpreted as skeptical. Rather, it is the occasion to unveil Jesus's identity as the coming one, and to invite the Q hearers not to wait for someone else. And as such, I think the question is well explained as an editorial creation by the author of Q. And after all, I ask myself, if John didn't consider Jesus to be a likely candidate as the coming one, then what kind of role could he have been wondering about for him? Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. We had recently, as you know, as Main of Seminar, a very interesting conference on John the Baptist. And this is a way to go back to some of his basic questions. Before giving the opportunity to Tobias and Cecilia to respond, I would like to add some more questions from Paula and Chris, so that then you can have the second round of response. Paula.
Thank you. Thank you, authors, for the book, and thank you, commentators, for your thoughtful and provocative observations. I wanted to quickly say a couple of things. First of all, Gabriele, to your point about some kind of preparation for the idea of resurrection, that's an argument in 1906 that Schweitzer talks about, of course. If it's a part of the package, this one of the signature miracles of the coming kingdom of God is the resurrection of the dead, which I bounce off of back to Tobias's point, where I'd want to, thinking with James Crosley's work, distinguish between apocalyptic eschatology and millenarianism per se, because a terrestrial kingdom of God is one thing, which gives you the opportunity to redesign Jesus as a social radical with the social program, versus, again, I can't help but look at Paul as a starting point for trying to understand these evolving traditions. If it's a non-terrestrial kingdom and people have, everyone has a summa pneumaticon, there's a lot more room for all those dead people. And you don't have the same kind still have. But in terms of the question of the empty tomb, so Tobias, we were right on the cusp of this question. Paul talks about not the, he uses the verb for seeing, of course, in 1 Corinthians 15. And here I'm thinking with the new work of Bazana on spirit possession as a way to understand seeing, because the spirit inhabits the followers. It takes possession of them, and that's how the manifestation is. Secondly, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, which is his most detailed discussion of resurrection, talks about the transmutation of the body, not the shedding of the body. So it's less like Ghost and Patrick Swayze and more like The Fly, if that helps anybody. So there's even though there's nothing about an empty tomb in Paul, if there's a suggestion that the body of flesh transmutes, or in Jesus's case, because he started out in a morphe theou and then he goes back to a morphe theou of a summa pneumaticon, I think there's an implication in Paul that the body, at least what the physical body was somehow missing, which is where you could begin to get the generation of the empty tomb stories. Thank you. And thank you all again.
Thank you, Paula. And now, Chris, if you want to, before giving again to Cecilia and Tobias.
Yes, thank you, all of you, for a wonderful discussion. I've not had the opportunity to read the book, so I'll just have to send my congratulations to the authors on getting it out. And obviously, it provided a lot of discussion, which is all of our hopes when we do that. The one comment I have on the discussion thus far, though, and I hate that it's going to come across like I'm rooting for the home team here, because I'm going to comment on something that Jane said. But I appreciated his point about the women as the earliest witnesses to the empty tomb. This is something that I have come across so much in scholarship that this just would have been, it had to have happened. No one would make this up. And I don't know that off the top of my head that I can think of a place where this has been thoroughly argued. It's just something that just gets recycled and recycled and recycled. So I appreciated those points. And I would personally love to see more discussion about that, about why this was so impossible, why it's treated as such. But those are my only comments. So I congratulate again the authors.
Thank you. I will like, before Cecilia, to give you opportunity also to very briefly to AJ and James to say some reaction from this conversation. AJ, unmute.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to pick up a point that Tobias made in response, which I thought was really helpful and could be developed. You talked about Jesus having a charismatic aura. And I want to push the idea of personal charisma over against like the radical whatever. I think that in his presence, people sense something. It's like, they've said the same thing about like Elvis Presley. And I'm not sure I like the comparison of Jesus to Elvis Presley any more than I do to Gandhi or the Buddha. But I think there's a sense that people felt calm and they felt assured, and he gave them hope. And that may be part of that good news in terms of an emotional appeal. But if the good news is that there's an abundance, that would be Isaiah, right? And that people live a very long time, then what we have is the world not as we know it, but as some new and improved version of it, which means whatever current system we have is gone. And that's an eschatological hope rather than a social justice hope. So I'm still wondering about what the good news is for the poor, other than, you know what, at some point you're going to be rich. Major change. And I'm still wondering, although this may be better for another time, and I tried to be more subtle about this than I should have been, which is really not my style, whether the whole historical Jesus enterprise would be, as this particular author labeled the synoptic problem, a white issue.
Thank you. Jim.
If it's all right, actually, I might pick up on what AJ was talking about then, because I think this raises a couple of very important issues. What I would further qualify or add or whatever footnote is explaining why these movements were popular is to look at material reasons for why these movements were popular. Why was this stuff taken off in certain times and so on and so forth? I think we can make the argument for the historical Jesus, as some of us have, that you've got two major building projects throwing up Cephas and Tiberius, throwing up all sorts of issues to do with the socio-economic world, and we're in the build-up over the first century to what would become the Jewish revolt against Rome. So you factor in figures like the Theudices, the Jesuses, the John the Baptist, or whatever. There is a sort of ready-made something going on along the ground. I mean, we know with these building projects, for instance, among many other things, of course, that people get displaced from land and move to the other. And I suspect the promise of being rich is probably right. It looks like there's just a role reversal in some of these teachings, as you will become the rich ones and you lot will be the ones who punish. And the second point there, Jerry, I mean, I think it's tapping into the whole thing anyway, so I don't want to just focus on a respondent, but is this whole enterprise like a white Jesus or whatever? I think we could map the history of this quite easily in some ways, that seeing these historical Jesus, a history of Western ideas and so on and so forth. And the question is how to get around it, and I know this is not easy. And the question about comparison, I think, is an important one. Maybe not Buddha, maybe not Gandhi. I don't think they are the right analogy. Elvis is interesting because, of course, he was resurrected as well. But the other one would be comparing the Jesus movement to sort of various peasant movements in different contexts and things like this, to try to give us some control over context. I know we'll never be perfect in all this. My own favorite example would be something like the English Peasants' Revolt or something like this. And there's very similar teachings on eschatology, end times, social justice, or what we would call social justice. I mean, this role reversals and things like this, to start doing more comparative work about similar types of movements in different contexts, different agrarian contexts, and so on, to see what we can come up with. We won't escape the constraints of our context, I doubt, but I think this will give us a more accurate Jesus.
If I may add also a comment of mine, I would like to repeat something that I said before, that for me one of the most important accomplishments of this book goes in the direction of overcoming this dichotomy between the apocalyptic Jesus and the non-apocalyptic Jesus. As we have seen also in our recent conference on apocalypticism, many things have changed in our understanding of what an apocalyptic prophet or apocalyptic Messiah was supposed to be. For instance, there has been a long tradition of opposition between apocalypticism and law. So in many cases, saying that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet meant to say that Jesus was against an antinomiistic leader, which is not the case, because apocalypticism, the apocalyptic tradition was not antinomiistic. Also, Tobias, the idea of forgiveness of sins, I mean, these new studies on the parables of Enoch in these latest years have emphasized very much how the problem of forgiveness of sins had entered the apocalyptic tradition, the Enochic tradition, in the parables of Enoch, with a very important role, which is something that we hadn't paid attention in the past. Often when we're talking about apocalyptic Jesus, we were making a dichotomy between a spiritual leader and a social reformer. The two things go together. So in my opinion, this conversation is very important. This stage of the conversation, historical Jesus, is very important, exactly because it's giving us the opportunity to overcome 2 centuries of historical research, in which we have put one against the other, those who believe that Jesus is apocalyptic and those who believe that Jesus was not. And I think that this does not make sense today, because of what we know about apocalypticism and what we know about the emphasis on repentance and changes of behavior and social implications of a message of Jesus. And I think this would be a great accomplishment. This would be a great accomplishment. It's something that we should discuss in the years to come. And now, Cecilia and Tobias, I would like to give you maybe 5 minutes each to 3-4 minutes each to some final important conclusions.
Important, yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Well, yes.
Perhaps I could say a few words about the empty tomb that
Yes.
that we've been talking about now.
The questions that Federico, Paola, Chris had asked. So
yeah, I agree with, or rather, I would see this issue as a very, the empty tomb is a very uncertain tradition for sure. and you say that the reference to women as witnesses has been recycled, and no one has sort of paid quite much attention to it. But of course, they could have simply gone to the wrong grave. It sounds silly, but of course, Jerusalem was the outside of the walls was littered with tombs. They've excavated about 1,000 tombs from the Second Temple period, and a little bit later. So, I mean, the story isn't impossible, but of course it's very uncertain. And then we do highlight the fact in the book that John will add the male disciples because it would have been more appropriate to have men there as well. So I think the story in itself is not impossible. I guess the question is, did they allow criminals, executed criminals, would they allow families to get the bodies back, or were they tossed away somewhere? I think that's where perhaps we could do more research, and we haven't. So it's a very uncertain. When you sort of weigh the evidence one way or another, we ended up taking this decision. We could have said, well, we don't know. These are the evidence for the one side, this is the evidence for the others. But all the way through the book, we have tried to draw conclusions, but also laying out the evidence. So that has been our way of doing it. But we could certainly continue discussing that part about John the Baptist's question. Yeah, I think we given the embarrassment in that question, we took it as a possible historical question, and also because of with Jesus' fame sort of rising, he might have wondered who was this former disciple of mine. Sort of, again, is possible, and it would be a strange just editorial comment to if there was nothing behind it. Sort of, you could make those what Federico was saying, those gave the author a chance to elaborate on the role of the Messiah and so on. You could do that in different ways, I guess. But thank you all for your comments. I can't and answer them all, and I also think I'm the wrong person to talk about the whiteness of the Synoptic Gospel and historical Jesus scholarship. We could have had a chapter on the sort of the history, but we're given the length issue of length. It's hard to write a very short chapter on the history of Jesus scholarship. But anyway, thank you for all your comments.
Maybe in the second edition.
Much appreciated.
Second edition, even a short chapter, because it's also a textbook. It's also a textbook. So yeah. I think that this book will be used in the classroom.
We hope so.
And so it will be useful. But thank you very much, Cecilia, for your comments. Tobias?
Yeah, maybe I can just add a few things to what Cecilia said, because it seems we have been writing together now for some time, so we start to think the same way as well, apparently. I was also interested in what you said, Federico, about the placement of the embassy of John the Baptist in Kew. This is one of the times when I really start to think, what really did we write in the book? And I think it's quite clear from the history of interpretation that quite early on you start to sense this embarrassment about this whole thing. How is it possible that John the Baptist wasn't dead sure that this was the Messiah? But that is, of course, something that you get from the placement in the extant synoptic gospels, where you have this very, I would say, quite certain preaching at the beginning of the synoptic gospels, at least Matthew and Mark, about where the coming one is to be identified as Jesus within the gospel contexts. And within that context, when you come to John the Baptist's question, of course, it sounds as if he's starting to doubt something. But probably, I would say, historically, it was the other way around. It is possible that John the Baptist started to ponder the question, or the possibility that Jesus may have had something to do with this coming one. But I think what you are saying here is something that draws attention to the trickiness of even the most fundamental of the traditional authenticity criteria. Okay, so we are invoking, at least implicitly, the criterion of embarrassment here. It seems to be embarrassing, but maybe on an earlier stage, in an earlier, now lost document, it was not at all embarrassing. It was very helpful. So that is, I think, if I get what you're saying, that is what you're saying or proposing here. So it just shows the trickiness of the whole enterprise, I think. Then on the empty tomb, yeah, I agree. This is very difficult. I think, though, that sometimes it is being overstated in the other direction, as if we were very confident that this is a very late tradition or addition, and it all began with the visions or the resurrection appearances, and then gradually this empty tomb tradition started to form. And I think one needs to be careful in both directions there. And I think there is one argument that we actually offer in the book that none of you really commented on, either because it was a very sharp argument or it's just a stupid argument. And that's the link between the very firm conviction that Jesus was raised on the third day. And the only explanation given in the New Testament for how they knew that he was risen on the third day is that they found the tomb, the empty tomb, on the third day. There is no claim that he appeared to them on the third day or anything like that. And I think it's very difficult to make that fit the time scheme or the time schedule that the first resurrection appearance could have taken place on the third day. So maybe there is an argument that we could discuss another time. And then this whole whiteness thing. I know it's a big thing in North America right now. I don't really get it. I mean, yes, empirically, yes, it has been, historical Jesus research has been done and made by white people and by men, of course. So far I get it. Then I think it's very much about what do you make out of these claims of historical Jesus research? Are they supposed to be the solution to everything? Are they supposed to be the most authentic thing you can get? Are they supposed to be hailed as now replacing all religious beliefs about Jesus, all theological musings about Jesus? I would say no. This is a socially located, socially conditioned way of approaching Jesus. And yeah, that's my take or not take on it. But thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you to all of you. Thanks to the authors, Tobias and Cecilia. Thank you to AJ and James, the respondents. Thank you to Federico, Paola, and Chris for joining the conversation. I think it's been a very, very thoughtful conversation, a very important conversation, and certainly not the end of the conversation. And thank you, Tobias and Cecilia, for having written such a provocative text that also summarize the status of research today. As you know, the Inner Seminar is hosting in its website reviews of books, but we have started also to offer online book presentations. So this is only the first of a series of book reviews, or book presentations that we want to offer. We have already other book presentations scheduled in the following months. I would like also to ask Joshua Scott for his technical assistance, as usually is invaluable, I mean, for our presentation, and to all the many people really that have attended this session, either here on Zoom or from Facebook. So it's very important, this opportunity that we have now to reach a quite large audience, and at the same time having a very meaningful scholarly presentation. So thank you to all, and I repeat, this is only one stage in a long series of meetings that we'll have in the next months and the next years about books like this, that brings us all together for meaningful conversation. Thank you. Thank you, Anne and Cecilia, and to you, congratulations again.